This video is sponsored by Taskade, a real-time organization and collaboration platform. Make sure to check the description for a discount on your subscription. Hey everyone, my name is Vishwas and welcome to this crash course on CSS Flexbox for complete beginners. In this crash course, we will understand the various concepts in Flexbox. Before we begin, let me go over a few points. First, I would like to mention this course is for complete beginners. If you're someone who is new to Flexbox or have an idea about Flexbox and want to understand better, please continue. If you are an expert, this is your cue to probably hop into another video where your time can be better utilized. Second, this video is a continuation of the CSS crash course. Make sure you're familiar with both HTML and CSS before proceeding. In this video, we are going to learn the important concepts in Flexbox. If you're also interested in CSS Grid, we will be learning that in a separate video. But if you have the question, should you be learning Flexbox or Grid? My advice would be to learn both. Flexbox is great for one-directional flow and can actually work alongside Grid for more complex layouts. It's not rare to see code bases which use both. Now please do make sure you code along with me, as that is the best way to learn. By the end of this video, you will have a solid understanding of creating layouts with CSS Flexbox. Alright, with these points in mind, let's get started. What is Flexbox? The CSS Flexible Box module, or simply known as Flexbox, is a one-dimensional layout model. It allows you to design flexible and efficient layouts, align and distribute space among items in a container. To put it in non-technical terms, Flexbox helps you arrange elements in a web page with ease. Now, why was this introduced? Well, before Flexbox, there were 4 layout modes. And we had a look at all of them in the CSS crash course. Block for sections in a web page, inline for text, table for two-dimensional table data, and positioned for explicit position of an element. These layouts, however, did not provide enough flexibility. We had to find all kinds of hacks to get the layout just the way we wanted. Working with floats, trying to vertically align content, create equal height columns, well, they were kind of a nightmare. The Flex layout, on the other hand, provides a lot of flexibility. With Flexbox, we can arrange items left to right, right to left, top to bottom, or bottom to top, and at the same time control the spacing, alignment, and order of items in the container. And to be honest, it has sort of become a must-know for front-end developers in 2022. If you're comfortable with HTML and CSS, Flexbox is the logical next step for you. Alright, now that we understand the what and why of Flexbox, let's dive into understanding the different concepts. We first need to start off by understanding the terminology in Flexbox. Trust me when I say this, the next few minutes you spend understanding what each term means will decide how easy it is to understand the Flexbox properties. Understanding the terminology is essential to this course, so please make sure you pay attention. When we talk about Flexbox, we mainly have 2 entities. A parent container, which we term as the Flex container, and the immediate children elements, which we term as Flex items. If you take a look at some sample HTML, the parent div is the Flex container, and all the children divs are the Flex items. Now we also deal with 2 axes when working with Flexbox. the main axis, and the cross axis. By default, the main axis runs left to right, and the cross axis is perpendicular to the main axis and runs top to bottom. The start point of the main axis is termed as main start, and the end point is termed as main end. The length from main start to main end is called the main size. So we can say that the flex items flow from main start till main end and take up the main size as the length. Similarly, with cross axis, we have cross start, cross end, and cross size. We can also change the direction of the main and cross axis by changing how the items are laid out in the container. We will talk more about that later in the course. Understanding Flexbox is basically getting familiar with the properties associated with the Flex container and the Flex items. Nothing fancy, you just learn it like how you learned CSS. Know what properties exist and how they work. With the terminology now familiar, let's begin by focusing first on the properties that are associated with just the Flex container. There are 10 in total. First, we have the display property. This is what defines a Flex container and is mandatory to work with Flexbox. Next is Flex direction. It defines the direction in which the Flex items are placed within the container. Third, we have Flex wrap, which is used to control the wrapping of items within the container. We then have Flex flow, which is a shorthand for the combination of Flex direction and Flex wrap. We then have column and row gap properties to set the gap between columns and rows, and just gap, which is a shorthand for both. There is justify content that defines the alignment of the items along the main axis, and similarly align items, which defines how Flex items are laid out along the cross axis. Finally, we have the align content property. This is similar to justify content, with the difference being this will align along the cross axis and not main axis. Also, this works only when there are multiple rows of Flex items in the container. Alright, now that we know the properties that can be applied to a Flex container, let's take a closer look at each of them. To get us started with Flexbox, I have set up some very simple HTML and CSS that I am now going to walk you through. I have created a folder called Flexbox Crash Course, and within the folder, I've created an index.html file and a styles.css file. The HTML is pretty standard. The head tag contains what you would normally find and a link to the CSS file. Within the body, we have a parent div tag with a class called container. This parent container has 9 div tags as children. Each div has a class Flex item and also a class specific to the item number. Item 1, item 2 till item 9. In the CSS file, I've set margin to 0 on the body element, and on the container class, I've added a thick black border. On the Flex item class, I've added a font color white, a font size of 1.5 rem, padding of 1 rem, and I've also center aligned the text. For items 1 through 9, I've set a different background color so as to visually separate each item in the browser. The HTML and CSS code can be found on my GitHub page in the Crash Course 2022 repo. I'll make sure to include a link in the description. Once you clone the repo or download the code, if you open the HTML file in the browser, you should be able to see this layout. You can see we have 9 items enclosed within the container that has a solid black border. Now we can focus on our very first property, which is the display property. To create a Flex container, we make use of the display property and set it to a value of Flex. In the CSS file, on the container class, add the property display and set it to Flex. Now, when I refresh the browser, you can immediately see the change. As with all properties in CSS, some initial values are defined. So when creating a Flex container, all of the contained Flex items behave in a certain way. First, they will display in a row. Second, items start from the beginning of the main axis, that is the leftmost point, but do not stretch till the end. However, they can shrink to a certain extent. Third, items will stretch to fill the size of the cross axis, that is from the top to the bottom. Also, you can notice from the border that the container itself has 100% width, so it does behave similar to a block level element. Now, if you do not want a block level Flex container, you can set the display property to inline Flex and create an inline Flex container. So back in the CSS file, display is inline Flex. If I now refresh, you can see the border now wraps around the Flex items. The container only takes up width to accommodate its children. So the display property is used to create either a block level or inline level Flex container. The possible values are Flex and inline Flex. The next property we are going to learn is Flex direction. The Flex direction establishes the main axis, which in turn decides how the Flex items are placed within the Flex container. By default, the main axis flows from left to right, which is the reason we see the items placed from left to right in the browser. By changing the value of the Flex direction property, we can change how the items are placed. Let's revert display to Flex and now define the Flex direction property. This property can accept one of 4 different values. The first value is row, which is the default value. So if we set Flex direction to row and refresh, you can see it doesn't make a difference. The items still flow from left to right. Flex direction of row sets the main axis from left to right and hence no change. The next allowed value is row reverse. And you might have guessed it, row reverse sets the main axis direction from right to left, which results in the Flex items being placed from right to left. If I refresh, you can see the items are now placed in the reverse order. Item 1 starts at the end of the container. The third allowed value is column. When you set Flex direction to column, the main axis flows from top to bottom. The items will be stacked on top of each other. Refresh the browser, and you can see the items flow from top to bottom. Item 1 at the top and item 9 at the bottom. Finally, we have column reverse, which stacks the items in the reverse order. If I refresh, you can see that item 9 is at the top and item 1 is at the bottom. So the Flex direction property sets the direction of the main axis, thereby controlling how the items are placed in the container. Possible values are row, which sets main axis from left to right, row reverse for right to left, column for top to bottom, and column reverse for bottom to top. Let's now move on to the third Flex container property, which is Flex Wrap. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the items in a Flex container can shrink to a certain extent to fit in a single line. If there is not enough space though, the items simply overflow. Let me show that to you. In the CSS file, I'm going to comment out Flex Direction and refresh the browser. If I now start to reduce the browser width, you can see that the items begin to shrink, but after a certain extent, they are no longer in view. You can change this behavior using the Flex Wrap property. In the CSS file, on the container class, I'm going to add a new property, which is Flex Wrap. Keep in mind, I haven't removed the display flex property on the container and never will throughout this course. Now, Flex Wrap can accept one of three possible values. The first one is no wrap, and this is the default value. When I refresh, you can see there is no change. If we want the items to wrap within the container, then we set a value of wrap. So Flex Wrap set to wrap. Now, when I refresh the browser, you can see that when I reduce the browser width, the items have been wrapped in the container, and the wrapping takes place only when needed. If I expand the browser width, there is no wrapping. If there is not enough space for just one item, which is item 9, you can see only item 9 moves into the next row. Reduce the size further. Item 8 moves into the next row, and so on. The final possible value is wrap reverse. And what wrap reverse does is, instead of items falling into the row below, it climbs into the row above. Let me show that in the browser. Refresh, and you can see we have 9 items. When I reduce the browser width, you can see that item 9, instead of moving to the row below, moves to the row above. Now, do not get confused that wrap reverse starts wrapping in the reverse order of items. Item 1 will not move into the second row if the space is inadequate. Wrapping always occurs from the last item. Wrap reverse just pushes the last item above instead of below. What you should know is that vertical wrapping of items is also possible. And for that, we need to change Flex Direction to column and add a height to the Flex container. So let's uncomment Flex Direction, set it to column, and we're going to add a height of 400 pixels. Let's also set Flex Wrap to just wrap. If we refresh, you can see that a column is created to the right and the items are placed in that column. So 7, 8, 9, which could not be accommodated with a height of 400 pixels, are shifted to the second column. If I change Flex Wrap to wrap reverse, refresh, the items are placed in a new column to the left. So, the Flex Wrap property is used to control the wrapping of Flex items within the container. The possible values are no wrap, which is default, wrap, which wraps the content into the next row or column, and wrap reverse, which wraps the content into the previous row or column. Alright, let's proceed to the fourth Flex container property, which is Flex Flow. It is a shorthand for Flex Direction and Flex Wrap. Let's comment height of 400 pixels, Flex Direction, and flex wrap. Instead, define flex flow. By default, the flex flow property is set to row and no wrap, which is the default value of the individual properties. The first value is the flex direction, and the second value is the flex wrap property value. If I refresh, and you can see once again the items are laid from left to right, and there is no wrapping of items. You can type any combination of the possible values and the layout will adjust accordingly. Let's go with flex flow set to row reverse and wrap. Refresh, and you can see the layout in the browser. The flex direction is from right to left, and when I reduce the browser width, the items are wrapped into the next row. So the flex flow property is a shorthand for flex direction and flex wrap. The first value is flex direction and the second value is flex wrap. All possible combinations of the two properties work just fine. Alright, let's now move on to the next set of properties which deal with spacing between rows and columns. First, we have the column gap property, which sets the gap between columns. For example, if we set column gap 20 pixels and refresh, we can see a gap of 20 pixels between the columns. Similarly, we can also set the gap between rows. The property is row gap, and we can set it to 30 pixels. To verify this property though, we need more than one row. So let's set flex wrap to wrap and head back to the browser. Refresh and reduce the browser width. You can see there is now a 30 pixel gap between the two rows. Now it's also possible to specify both column and row gap using the gap shorthand property. So let's comment these out and instead set gap to 40 pixels and 20 pixels. Here, the first value is the row gap and the second value is the column gap. When I refresh, you can see 40 pixels between the rows and 20 pixels between the columns. So, to specify gap between columns, you can use the column gap property. To specify gap between rows, you can use the row gap property. You can also use the shorthand gap property to specify both row gap and column gap. The values can be a non-negative value or a percentage. Now, let's move on to the next set of properties which are concerned with alignment. We're going to start with the justify content property. To see the alignment more clearly, I'm going to reduce the number of items from 9 down to 5. Alright, now justify content defines the alignment along the main axis. Let's understand with the UI how the different values work. By default, justify content is set to the value flex start, which places the flex items at the beginning of the main axis, which is also known as main start. If I refresh the browser, you can see there is no difference in the alignment. The second possible value is flex end. This causes the flex items to be placed at the end of the main axis, which is also known as main end. If I refresh, you can see the items are now placed at the end of the main axis. We can also align the content at the center of the main axis. Set the value to center and refresh the page. The content is now placed at the center of the main axis. So these are some of the values you would expect for alignment: left align, right align, and center align. But Flexbox provides additional values that can control how the extra space has to be distributed within the container. We have a value of space between. So justify content, space between. When I refresh, you can see the extra space within the container is evenly split and added in between the different Flex items. Sometimes you might also want the space before the first item and after the last item. For such a scenario, the value is space around. Let me change space between to space around and refresh the browser. You can see there is now space at the beginning and at the end. And the space is equal to half of the space between the Flex items. For example, if space in between the items is 20 pixels, space at the start and end would be 10 pixels. However, if you want the same space at the start and end of the items as well, the value you're looking for is space evenly. If I change the value of justify content to space evenly and refresh the browser, you can see the extra space is equally distributed within the container. A very important point to keep in mind is that justify content property aligns items based on the main axis. So if we set flex direction to column, which changes the main axis from top to bottom, justify content deals with vertical alignment. So if I uncomment flex direction set to column and set a height of, let's say, 800 pixels to add extra space within the container, and change justify content to flex start, refresh the browser, you can see all the items are pulled to the top. If the value is flex end, refresh, all the items are pushed to the bottom. Set the value to center, refresh, and you have vertically centered content. Something that was a real struggle before Flexbox. Now space between, space around, and space evenly behave the same way. I'm going to let you try them out. So the justify content property is used to align items and distribute any extra spacing in the parent container. The alignment is always along the main axis. The possible values are flex start, flex end, center, space between, space around, and space evenly. Alright, the next alignment property is the align items property. Align items defines the default behavior for how flex items are laid out along the cross axis of the container. This means it works just like justify content, but in the perpendicular direction. Again, let's understand with the UI how the different values work. To visualize the changes, we need a height on the container. So let's set height to 800 pixels. By default, the value of align items is stretch. That means the flex items stretch the entire length of the cross axis. So if I set align items to stretch and head back to the browser, refresh, you can see the items take up all the available height of the container. So they stretch to fill the container. So stretch is the default value. The second value we can specify is flex start. All the items are pushed to the cross start, which is the starting point of the cross axis. So if I refresh, you can see even though the container is 800 pixels in height, the items do not stretch and are aligned with the cross start of the line. Similar to flex start, we also have flex end. And this value as you might have guessed, will push the items to the bottom of the container, or pushes the items to the end of the cross axis. The fourth possible value is center, which centers the content along the cross axis. So refresh, and the items are now placed at the center of the cross axis. The last value I want to discuss is baseline. To help us understand baseline, I've got this image from Stack Overflow. If there is a word, for example, Sphinx, the baseline is the line upon which most letters sit. Now coming to Flexbox, the base value for flex items will align flex items along their contents baseline. You can see we have 5 items, each with different heights and content size. But you can see how all the content in the flex items sit on this baseline. So if you ever want the text inside the items to line up, go with baseline. Let's quickly take a look at an example. I'm going to slightly modify the CSS for the first 3 items. On item 1, padding bottom 3 rem. On item 2, padding bottom 5 rem. And on item 3, padding bottom 3 rem. Now I can set align items to baseline. If I refresh, you can see that the text inside each item is aligned. The item itself is positioned based on where the text will sit. Now you can also flip the axis by setting flex direction to column and test how the alignment works. I'm going to leave that to you as an exercise. So the align items property is used to align items and distribute any extra space in the parent container. The alignment is always along the cross axis. The possible values are flex start, flex end, center, baseline, and stretch, which is the default value. Alright, let's now proceed to the last property that can be applied on the flex container, which is the align content property. The align content property aligns lines of content along the cross axis, similar to how justify content aligns individual items within the main axis. So it distributes additional space, but along the cross axis. And a very important condition is that multiple lines or rows must exist within the container. If not, it has no effect. Let's understand the different possible values with the UI. First, make sure to have a height on the container and also enable wrapping of items. So height 800 pixels and flex wrap set to wrap. Wrapping is required to force our content into 2 lines. So let's go back to HTML. Let's also uncomment the remaining 4 items. Head back to the browser and refresh. If I reduce the width, you can see the content wraps into 2 rows. The align content property is used to align these rows of content within the container. The default value is stretch. You can see both the lines stretch to fill the available space. So if we set align content to stretch and refresh the browser, you can see there is no change. The second value possible is flex start. This pulls the rows to the beginning of the cross axis. Refresh, and you can see the cross axis runs from top to bottom, so the content of lines is pushed to the very top. Let's also get rid of the padding we had just added. So from item 1, remove padding bottom, from item 2 and 3 as well. Align content, flex start, Refresh. You can see the rows of items are pulled to the top. Similarly, we also have flex end, which pushes the content to the end of the cross axis. If I refresh, you can see the content is at the bottom. You can also center the content by specifying a value of center. Refresh, and you can see the content is center aligned. The fourth value is space between, which takes all the extra space and puts it in between the rows. Refresh, and you can see all the space is in between the two rows. Finally, we have space around, which distributes the space around the lines. Refresh, and you can see the space distributed. The center portion has twice as that of the edges. So the align content property is used to align lines of content or rows of content along the cross axis and distribute any extra spacing in the parent container. The possible values are flex start, flex end, center, space between, space around, and stretch, which is the default value. With that, we have covered all the properties that work on a flex container. Next, let's take a look at the list of properties applicable on a flex item. First, we have order. The order property controls the order in which they appear in the flex container. Next, we have flex grow, which defines the ability for a flex item to grow if necessary. On similar lines, there is flex shrink, which defines the ability for a flex item to shrink if necessary. After that, we have flex basis, which specifies the initial mean size of a flex item. We are also going to quickly take a look at the flex property, which is a shorthand for flex grow, flex shrink, and flex basis. We will wrap up flex item properties with align self, which allows alignment of individual flex items. Alright, now that we know the properties that can be applied to a flex item, let's take a closer look at each of the properties, starting with the order property. On the container class, if I comment out all the properties except display and border, with display being set to flex, it is quite evident that flex items in a container are laid out in the order in which they appear in the source code. That, however, can be changed using the order property. In our example, we have 9 items, and you can see they are laid out item 1 through 9, which is the order in which they appear in the code. Let's mix up this order. In the CSS, for item 3, I'm going to set order 1. If we refresh the browser, you can see that item 3 is pushed all the way to the end. And that is because all flex items by default have an order of 0. Order 1 is greater than the order of all other items, and hence item 3 appears at the very end. If I change the order of item 7 to 2, refresh, you can see that item 7 is pushed to the end. Order 0 first, then order 1, and then order 2. If you specify the same order number for more than one item, items are laid out in the order in which they appear in the source code. For example, if I specify order of 1 to item 9, you can see that both item 3 and item 9 have the same order. But in the HTML, item 3 appears before item 9. And if I refresh, That is how the items are laid out in the browser. So the order property accepts an integer value and is used to control the order of items in the Flex container. Elements with the same order value are laid out in the order in which they appear in the source code. The next property that can be applied to a Flex item is the FlexGrow property. FlexGrow specifies what amount of space inside the Flex container the item should take up if necessary. The FlexGrow factor is always relative to the size of the other children in the Flex container. Let's understand how it works with the UI. By default, you can see that the Flex items only take up space that is required to fit the content. So there is a lot of extra space within the container. Sometimes you don't want the additional white space. Instead, you want the Flex items to grow to take up the remaining space. By default, all Flex items have a FlexGrow value of 0, which is why they don't take up the available extra space. Let's change that for one of the items and see what happens. In the CSS file, for item 5, I will set FlexGrow to 0 to begin with. When I refresh the browser, you can see there is no change. So 0 is the default value. When I change this to 1 though, refresh, you can see the change right away. Item 5 now grows to take up all the remaining space in the container. Let's add the property to item 6 as well. FlexGrow set to 1. Now if we refresh, you can see that the additional space has been evenly distributed between the two Flex items. If there was 100 pixels available, item 5 would grow by an additional 50 pixels, and item 6 would also grow by an additional 50 pixels. Now let me change the value of FlexGrow on item 6 to 3 from 1. What do you think is going to happen? Refresh. And you can see that item 5 and 6 both grow, but item 6 takes up the extra space 3 times as much as item 5. Remember, FlexGrow factor is relative. If item 5 grows by 25 pixels, item 6 has to be 3 times that and hence grows by 75 pixels. You can specify decimal values as well to FlexGrow and it works completely fine. Do not specify negative values. Now if we want all the items to grow to take up the extra space evenly, we simply add FlexGrow and set it to 1 for all the Flex items. So in the CSS, let me comment out FlexGrow on the individual items. And instead, on the Flex item class, which is applied to every item in the HTML, let's add FlexGrow and set it to 1. Refresh, and you can see all the items grow evenly to take up the leftover space. Nice and clean. So the FlexGrow property dictates what amount of the available space inside the Flex container the item should take up. FlexGrow factor is also relative to the other items in the container. By default, the value is 0, which dictates the items should not grow. Setting a FlexGrow value of 1 on all the Flex items will cause the Flex items to grow evenly whenever there is additional space in the container. Now on the other side of FlexGrow, we have the FlexShrink property. As you might have already guessed, FlexShrink defines the ability for a Flex item to shrink if necessary. Unlike FlexGrow, the default value for FlexShrink is 1. However, the FlexShrink factor is still relative to the other items in the container. Let's understand with the UI. The first point to make note of is that FlexShrink is set to a value of 1 by default for every single flex item. And that is why if I try to reduce the width of the parent container, the flex items shrink to fit inside the container. In case you missed that, let me repeat it. You can see the flex items width. If I decrease the screen size, the width of the flex items also decrease. They are shrinking. But the shrinking only happens up to a certain point, after which the items simply overflow. You can see that items 8 and 9 are not visible anymore. Now let's say you don't want the shrinking happening on the flex items. For that, simply set the flex shrink value to 0. On the flex item class, which is applied to every flex item, set flex shrink to 0. Now, if I go back to the browser, refresh, reduce the width, you can see there is no shrinking and the items overflow right away. It is also possible to control the shrinking for individual items. I'm going to comment out flex shrink on the flex item class and add a flex shrink of 4 to item 3. Now what this specifies is item 3 is going to shrink 4 times as much as the other items. Remember, this is a relative factor. If all the other items shrink by 25 pixels, item 3 shrinks by 100 pixels. Let's see this in action. And just for this property demo, I'm going to add a width to the flex items class to make them larger. So width is going to be equal to 6 rem. Now you can see all the items occupy the same size. If I start decreasing or reducing the width though, you can see item 3 decreases more than the other items. Let me repeat it in case you missed that. Reduce the browser width, and you can see item 3 shrinks more than the other items. So, the flex shrink property dictates the shrink factor of the flex items when the default size of the flex items is larger than the flex container. It is always relative to other items in the container. By default, the value is 1, which dictates the items should shrink to a certain extent if necessary. Alright, let's move on to the next property, which is flex basis. The flex basis property specifies the initial size of a flex item before the extra space in the container is distributed. This is used in place of the width property in flex layouts. So it can accept values in percentages, pixels, rems, or even keywords like auto. Let's understand better with the UI. By default, flex basis has a value of auto, which sets the initial width based on the item's content. In our case, you can see that the item's width is dependent on the text inside. If I change the text on item 1 to item 1 flex basis and refresh, the item now has a larger initial width. Back in the CSS file, on item 1, I'm going to add flex basis and set it to auto. If I refresh, you should not be seeing any difference as it is the default value. If I change the value to 200 pixels and refresh, you can see the initial size of item 1 is now 200 pixels. And what you have to make note of here is that flex grow and flex shrink apply on top of flex basis. For example, on item 1, if FlexGrow is set to 1, refresh, the extra space is added onto the 200 pixels. It could be 300 pixels after growing. Flexbox doesn't try to decrease its growth just because it is larger than the other items to begin with. And the same goes with Flex Shrink as well. So the Flex Basis property is used to set the initial size of a flex item. You can specify values in pixels, percentages, or relative units. By default, the value is auto, which decides the item's width based on the item's content. Alright, the next property applicable to a flex item is the Flex property, which is a shorthand for FlexGrow, Flex Shrink, and Flex Basis. Although we can specify the three properties individually, the recommended way is to use the Flex property. Since we have already covered the three properties, I'll walk you through slides for this property. I recommend you play around with it in code when you get the time. Now Flex accepts three values separated by a space. The first is FlexGrow, the second is Flex Shrink, and finally Flex Basis. You can see that it is much simpler and easier as well. By default, Flex property has a value of 0, 1 auto. 0 for FlexGrow, which implies the items will not grow to fit the container. 1 for Flex Shrink, which implies the items will shrink when necessary. And auto for Flex Basis, which implies the width of the items depends on their content. The Flex property can be specified using 1, 2, or all three values. Try experimenting with different values and you'll get a good understanding of the Flex property. Let's now move on to the last Flex item property, which is the Align Self property. Align Self is used to control the alignment of individual items. The values are pretty much the same that are applicable for the Align Items property on the Flex container. Let's take a look at them one by one. The first value is Flex Start, which aligns the items at the start of the cross axis. On item 1, let's set Align Self to Flex Start. Let's also set a height of 400 pixels on the container. If we take a look at the browser, refresh, you can see the item is pulled to the top, which is where the cross axis starts. The second value is Flex End, which aligns the item with the end of the cross axis. On item 2, let's set Align Self to Flex End. And you can see the item is pushed to the bottom of the cross axis. The third value is Center. So let's add Align Self Center on item 3 and refresh. You can see item 3 is centered. The fourth value is Stretch, which stretches the item from cross start to cross end. On item 4, if I set Align Self to Stretch and refresh, you can see item 4 is stretched. But so are items 5 through 9. Now you might think, okay, stretch is the default value for Align Self. But that is not true. The default value for Align Self is auto, and Align Self is computed from the Align Items property of the parent Flex container. Now items 5 through 9 are stretched because the container has Align Items of stretch, which is the default value. Starting to get a bit confusing, isn't it? Well, let me go over this slowly. Flex container, which is the parent container, has no Align Items property set. So what is the default value? It is stretch. So container has align items set to stretch by default. Now flex item 5, does it have align self? No. But what is the default value of align self? It is auto. And what does auto specify? Well, it specifies to take the value of the parent's align items value. So item 5 takes the value of stretch. So do items 6, 7, and so on. Now if I specify align items on the parent container and set it to flex end, items 5 through 9 will now inherit that value. And if I refresh, you can see that they are pushed to the end of the cross axis. Now I understand this is a bit overwhelming to keep track of, but I hope you now have a place to come back to anytime you need to understand what is going on with the layout in your web page. So, align self property is used to align the items individually. It accepts values like auto, flex start, flex end, center, and stretch. If specified, it will always override the align items value of the flex container. Alright, with that, we wind up with the different properties that are part of the Flexbox module. And in doing so, we have come to the end of this crash course on CSS Flexbox. I hope the video has given you an idea of how to lay out elements with CSS using the Flexible Box module. If you have enjoyed the video, please do leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more content on web development. I'll see you in the next video, which is a crash course on CSS Grid.